Welcome to the Strand's Rare Book Room. My name is Nancy Bass-Wyden. I am the owner of the Strand. For a little bit of history, the store was founded 92 years ago by my grandfather, Benjamin Bass. It was part of Book Row, which was an area that ran along 4th Avenue from Union Square to Astor Place. At its height, there were 48 bookstores, and since all that time, all of them have shuttered except for the Strand. And I just want to thank you, voracious readers, that we're still family-owned and thriving. In fact, we have such a active events program. We have 400 cutting-edge events a year, and you might have gotten this flyer, too. Some up-and-coming ones include Naomi Klein and Deborah Harry, so please join us for more. Tonight, I'm so excited to welcome back Caitlin Doughty to the Strand. We helped her launch her first book here, the best-selling Smoke Gets in Your Eyes, 4 years ago. Since then, she's published another best-selling book, From Here to Eternity, and continues her work on her Ask a Mertrician web series, which has got over 800,000 followers. She's also founder and head of the Order of the Good Death. Tonight, we're here to discuss Will My Cat Eat My Eyeballs? And she will, which answers that question and plenty more that she's been asked by curious kids. It draws on Caitlin's scientific understanding of the body, as well as the history and misconceptions surrounding corpses. And she'll answer these basic yet baffling questions about death and dying. Caitlin also plans to incorporate one new question from her book tour in her paperback edition, which will come out next year. So please think of a good one for the Q&A. I couldn't be more thrilled to welcome Caitlin back to the Rare Book Room to this sold-out event. Thank you all.
Hello, New York. Thank you all for coming. I know that a wacky, fun death event on 9/11 is kind of a hard sell, but I think that the people in this room are probably hardcore, morbid followers and willing to have the conversation whenever it happens. So I want to do two things with you tonight. First is I want to tell you a little story, and then I want to read you a little bit from the book. And now I'm going to tell you a third thing. I started with two, not true, three things, and then we'll do a Q&A. It's mostly about the Q&A, you queuing, me A-ing. But first I'm going to start with the story. Is that okay? So, question, do I need to stand in the center because of the camera? Strand folks? I do. Okay, so I can't just like take a walk because I'll just disappear from the stream. Okay, fine. That's going to be hard for me because I really like just doing this the whole event, but fine. I will be contained to this podium. No, this is fine. This is perfect. All right, now I will begin. Okay, so my story is that last week I was asked to do a conference. And normally I give talks that are about funeral industry reform. So I can talk about alkaline hydrolysis law implementation all day, every day, but they wanted me to give a talk on myself and my personal history. And I didn't want to do that as first, but then I eventually did it. And something that I've been thinking a lot about for that talk is what makes a morbid child? What does that mean? And some of you in this room probably have had to ask yourself that same question. Seeing some nods. So I went back, and when I was home a couple of months ago with my parents to do their wills, because my mother had been lying to me about having a will. And I was like, Mom, no, my brand. How? Why? There's a will now. No one worry. Yeah, let's give a hand. Let's give a hand to my mom for lying to me. for years. She was like, you just meant so much to you that I just told you I did it. That's not how that works. So I was helping them clean out their attic and helping them do their will. And I found all this old boxes of stuff from when I was a child. And one of the first documents was a little award from my second grade teacher, one of those that they give every millennial, which is why we're all messed up now. Like and subscribe, everyone. Love me. And it said, "Congratulations, Caitlin Doughty, like super job on," and then the teacher had filled in, "on a good witch story." Who knows what that was? We don't have documentation of that, but what we do have is my diary from 3rd grade. And it's not really fair to call it a diary because it's completely empty, completely blank, except for one single entry in this Hello Kitty diary. And the single entry says, "Dear diary, today is Halloween. Finally, it's come." And I never kept a diary after that. So the only insight into my young mind, direct to the source, unfiltered, is "today it's Halloween, finally it's come." Which I think explains a lot. And to say something, my mother, the first time I was ever, back to my mom, sorry mom, this is taped too. The first time that I was ever profiled anywhere was in the Huffington Post in 2012. And the reporter actually called my mom to interview her. And a direct quote from that article is about her and my dad. And she said, "We came to find out that she was interested in death, and we had somehow missed the signs." Which is very like early 90s anti-drug commercial, right? Like she was eating all these potato chips, but we never suspected marijuana. But like, Mom, there were some signs. And keep in mind that I was born and raised in Hawaii. So I was really torn between two worlds here. There's a picture of me from, I think, like 10th grade, and I'm wearing Aloha print shorts for School Spirit Day and like a surf logo t-shirt and then black Doc Marten combat boots. And I'm leaning against a fence like, oh, it's so hard. It's like, you're wearing blue flower shorts right now. I don't know how that goes. And I also was torn between two worlds because I was trying to figure out what I was really interested in. And I would go at night, I would sneak out and go to these goth and fetish clubs. There were two in Hawaii. One was Flesh and one was The Dungeon. And I would go dance at those, and then I would sleep in my car and wake up the next morning and go to that Saturday's activity, which was open ocean outrigger canoe paddling practice. And I also went to a really conservative Episcopal girls' school, like uniform, the whole 9 yards. And we had Christianity classes every year. And at the end of 10th grade Christianity, we had to write a whole long report on one single character from the Bible. And I chose Satan. And I got an A+ because I researched the crap out of Satan. I deserved that A+. I knew so much about Satan. And this continued until I became the editor of my yearbook my senior year. And I was so proud of this. Looking back on it now, though, I have some questions as to who let me do what I did, which is, do any of you in this room remember the band AFI? My entire yearbook was themed around the band AFI. Including flames on the cover, and when you open it, it was 3 of my classmates, sort of their heads roiled back laughing, but because I had photoshopped flames all around them, it looked like they were like writhing in hell. And it reminds me, looking back at this yearbook, which is sort of painful for me, it reminds me of that Ira Glass quote that says, like, the first couple of years that you're making things, those things are not gonna be very good. This yearbook is truly not good. So then I go on to college on the mainland, and I am manager of this student-run coffee shop. And in our second Who Let Her Do That question, I was allowed to launch a renaming campaign for the coffee shop, which was previously called Uncle Joe's, and then choose its replacement name, which I decided was Hallowed Grounds. And it's still named that today because they're suckers. Anyway, so no, it's a good name. I think it's a good name. So then I went on to become a medieval history major, and I wrote medieval history. And I wrote my thesis on the late medieval witch trials called In Our Image, the Suppression of Demonic Births in Late Medieval Witchcraft. So I wrote a thesis basically on demon babies. So this is all to say that by the time I was 22 and got my first job at a crematory in the Bay Area, I think, Mom, there were indeed some signs that I was a morbid child and had moved right along into being a morbid adult. And looking back on that timeline, actually, as painful as it was to give a talk on something totally not related to what I do, in a sense, I really did appreciate the fact that I had been allowed to have that trajectory and that I was allowed to just live my happy, morbid life. Because I think, so this might not be totally relatable to people in this room, or maybe you've overcome this, but children have such a natural, profound, kind of beautiful, blunt, morbid curiosity. And then they ask those questions of their parents or people in their school or people older than them. And we say, oh no, that's morbid. Don't say that. That's not the right thing to say. Don't think about it. And of course, if I tell you right now to this room, do not think about a purple cow. Haha, I gotcha. You're all thinking about a purple cow. That's not how it works. You can't tell children, do not think about this thing. In fact, that only triggers our brain to think, maybe I should think, why can't we talk about this thing? It must be much worse than I thought. So the fact that we're all here in this room, and we're probably most of us morbid children, and are now allowed to continue indulging in this curiosity in death, and the fact that there's science in death, and history in death, and literature in death, and anthropology in death, and that we're allowed to think about all these things and integrate it into our adult lives, we're actually incredibly lucky. And I just wanted to do a little ode to that fact. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to read just a short chapter from the new book, which is Will My Cat Eat My Eyeballs? All questions sourced from authentically free-range organic children. Morbid kids in and of themselves. And some of them are like blonde. You would never tell they're morbid. And that's the thing. They don't need signifiers to tell the world they're morbid. Okay. Not that morbid signifiers are bad. I mean, look at me. Okay. So the question I chose is, why don't animals dig up all the graves? Question from a child. It depends what type of grave you're talking about. If you bury a family pet, like your cat, your dog, or your fish, if it escaped the flush to the great beyond, it's possible that another wild animal, like a coyote, might dig that grave up. The coyote isn't participating in ritual grave desecration, it's just looking for a free meal. Listen, it's not the coyote's fault that your family dug that backyard hole for Fido only a foot deep. Psst, not deep enough. As an animal begins to decompose beneath the soil, it produces some very pungent-smelling compounds called cadaverine and putrescine, compounds named for cadaver and putrid. Adorable, right? To a scavenger animal, those decomposition compounds smell a lot like dinner. If they sense their meal is an easy dig away, they might go for it. There's a simple fix here. Shovel down a little deeper, I will reveal just how deep in a second, for Fido's eternal resting spot. But what about human cemeteries? Cemeteries exist in almost every town, but one rarely sees scavenger animals roaming around, digging up fresh bodies for food. That's not to say it's impossible. In remote parts of Russia and Siberia, armed guards have had to stand watch at cemeteries after brown and black bears broke in to dig up human remains. In one memorable story, 2 village women thought they were seeing a man in a big fur coat bending down to tend to a loved one's grave. Wrong, it was a bear eating a dead body it had dug out of the ground. Sorry, ladies. Another recent story from Bradenton, Florida, involves neighbors noticing dog or coyote tracks around half a dozen graves at a local cemetery. Fresh holes had been dug, releasing a gnarly smell. Body bags poked out of the ground. I mention these two horror stories to make an important point. They are the exceptions that prove the rule. For the most part, animals won't dig up human graves. There are several reasons why. First, the correct amount of soil laid on top of the body creates a scent barrier. Second, the soil not only covers up the powerful smell, but it actively works to decompose the body, leaving behind a stenchless skeleton. The soil is magic. The real question is, how deep is deep enough for a grave? Just to be safe, shouldn't we bury all of our humans 6 feet under in the heaviest caskets we can make and fortify them in underground concrete bunkers? No. Because the soil's magic benefits are most magical, scientific terms here, near the surface. That's where you find the highest numbers of fungi, insects, and bacteria that efficiently decompose a body from human to skeleton. If you bury a body too far down, the soil grows sterile. Topsoil has more oxygen, which means your body can become a tree, or a bush, or a shrub, at least. To become one with the earth, you want to be as close to the surface as possible. So what's the compromise here? There are those who argue that a body needs to be buried a full 6 feet down, but there are also those who argue that just 1 foot of soil is needed to create a smell barrier. I think that 3.5 feet is a good compromise. 3.5 feet, you won't become a treat, as the old saying goes. This is not an old saying, FYI. That depth puts at least 2 feet of smell barrier above the corpse while maintaining the benefits of that awesome decomposing soil near the surface. 3.5 feet is the standard at natural burial grounds across the United States, and there have been 0 reports of animals digging up graves. Full disclosure, even if you're buried under 2 to 3 feet of dirt, it's still possible that animals may get a whiff of you. Every once in a while, animal tracks, like coyote, are spotted around a gravesite. As if to say, well, well, what have we here? But they don't dig up the grave because it's too much damn work. Think of it like this. Why do I get Taco Bell from the drive-thru instead of cooking myself a spinach kale casserole for dinner with organic ingredients from the farmer's market? If scavenger animals can get food elsewhere, it's not worth it for them to dig 2 feet down into the soil and try and haul up your giant human butt. Scavengers have other things to worry about, like protecting their territory and themselves. They don't have the time and energy to dig that massive hole just to chew on your femur. Besides, animals like coyotes and bears aren't physically well suited to digging that deep. So why were those bears in Siberia messing around in the graveyard? I suspect it's because the graves weren't deep enough. The ground is often frozen that far north. If it's easier for a bear, who, remember, does not have great digging paws, to dig up Grandpa's corpse than it is for the bear to hunt, the graves aren't deep enough. Second, and much more important, the bears were starving. Their mushrooms and berries, and the occasional frog, apparently, that made up their normal diet were in short supply. The bears began by raiding the cemetery for food that families had left as offerings at the graveside. They were eating everything from cookies to candles, whatever they could find to stay alive. Only after raiding that easy-to-access food did the bears turn to digging up the bodies. And what about that cemetery in Florida? In this older, abandoned cemetery, why were there fresh graves and terrible smells and body bags? It turns out the graves had been dug by a local funeral home to bury homeless people. And because the abandoned cemetery didn't have any government oversight, the funeral home is alleged to have buried the bodies in extremely shallow graves. Since then, the director has put cement slabs over the graves. Good thing there are no bears in Bradenton, Florida. Turns out there are, but they're very rare. I'll end with a lesson about badgers digging up medieval bones. Back in the Middle Ages, people used to be buried right outside and even inside churches. Lots and lots of people. The human remains were supposed to have been moved away from this one particular 13th century English church back in the 1970s, but it turns out they weren't all moved. We discovered this because badgers invaded and started digging dens and networks of tunnels down through the ancient bones, sending pelvises and femurs flying to the surface. Someone should stop those badgers. Whoops, they can't. In England, it's illegal to kill these furry creatures or even move their dens. Thanks to the Protection of Badgers Act, yes, that's real, we're looking at 6 months in prison and huge fines for even attempted badger assault. Workers at the church have to pick up the bones, say a prayer, and bury them back in the ground. The lesson here is that even if you make it almost 1,000 years in the grave, you never know when you'll be uprooted by a lawless badger. Thank you. Lawless Badger is also my punk band name. Oi, we're Lawless Badger. Thank you. Let's do a Q&A. We have a microphone, right? So Sabir is our microphone man here.
We have Destiny on the side with a microphone as well.
Oh, and Destiny. Hi, Destiny. Hi. And keep in mind, so normally when we do the after, first of all, if you want to just leave, I understand. If you're the type of person who's interested in a photo and a hug, I'd be happy to do that. But normally I also do kind of like questions and talkie-talkie after the event, but because the Strand has to close and it's a nice big crowd, we're gonna have to move it a little quicker. So if you have a question, now is the time, my friends. Don't be shy.
Hello. I have a question. I know that my local graveyard near me, as well as a few that I've been to in other places where I vacation, like Key West, they have infestations usually of certain creatures. Like Key West is weird. They've got iguanas and parrots.
Ooh, those are fun infestations.
Yeah, and like 3 or 4 of them near me in Jersey have skunk problems, but they're not in the surrounding areas. What would attract them to graveyards that have properly buried dead?
That's interesting. I mean, the only thing I could think of, I don't think that they're like parrots. I don't think are like, I smell the cadaverine and this shall be my spot. I mean, that's cool, but I don't think that's the reason. I think it's probably because there are not a lot of people in the cemetery and there are not a lot of people probably messing with them all that much in the cemetery, while as if they're in the surrounding suburban areas, everybody's like, get out, get out, get out, get out. And they may have just found a nice spot where nobody's coming after them in the cemetery, which is also how I feel about cemeteries. A cemetery is an introvert's dream. Like, it's great fun to go there and it's very peaceful. So if I were an iguana, I would probably tell all my iguana friends to come live in the cemetery too. But that's actually a really good question. I'm not sure the exact scientific reason for that, but I'm gonna look into that more. Yes. Oh, hi.
I'm actually asking on behalf of, sorry, I'm going to call her out, but my niece.
Everyone, we have a child in the house. Excellent. Hello, child.
So
yes.
This is Hazel. She's 8 years old.
Hi, Hazel.
And she would like to know what got you started being interested in death.
You know, I mean, other than my obvious eight-year-old obsession with Halloween, I actually saw a death when I was really young. And it was really painful for me. It made me very, very sad and gave me a lot of emotions because I grew up and I didn't have cool people like your aunt to talk me through death and answer my questions about death. And I think that's what made it harder for me. And we all grew up in this culture where we know that it's not super safe to have conversations about death. And so I grew up really thinking that I was sort of alone in this, that everyone around me was going to die eventually, and nobody seemed to know it. You know, nobody seemed to understand this fact. So I think a lot of what I do when I grew up was to try and turn that fear into fascination. And if I am afraid of something, I'm really likely to research it a lot. Something else that I am deeply afraid of is whales. For some reason, I am just terrified of whales, like literal whales in the deep blue sea. And I think part of that is because they're just so big. Why are they so big? Nothing should be that big. And I think of the big open ocean and I'm like, what creatures are looming in its depths? And something I've become very, very obsessed with is orcas. I know so much about orcas and orca captivity and orca behavior. They're incredibly smart. And I got on that because I was first afraid of it. So if you're ever afraid of something, learning as much as you can about it, and then maybe even sharing that enthusiasm and what you learn with others is really the best way, I think, to get over it. So anytime you come up in your life with something you're afraid of, just research the crud out of it. And that's how I became a mortician, which wasn't your exact question, but that is really how I became a mortician, honestly. And I went to mortuary school. That too. Thank you for your question, Hazel. Yeah, pick another victim. Hi.
Hi. So I have a really severe latex allergy, and that's prevented me from going to funerals.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any like group or advocacy area that could be contacted to be like, hey guys, this is a problem?
That's actually not the first time I've heard that question or heard someone say that was what was preventing them from going in the funeral industry. And incidentally, I also got an email very recently from an advocate for green funerals in Canada who said, I need you to look into we talk about the fact that embalming isn't very green and that caskets aren't very green and vaults aren't very green, but we never talk about all the extra stuff that's being used in funerals, all of the gowns, all of the latex gloves, all of the chemicals, all of the additional things that maybe we're not being really mindful of at a funeral home. So before tonight, I might have told you there's not really, but I think that you should talk to this person, because if she could have a real life story about why someone isn't allowed to serve families or work in a funeral home, that might actually really help the advocate she's trying to push. So if you're able to come see me after, I will give you her information. Cool. I'm sorry about that, though. That's not great. Hi. You.
Hi.
Hi.
I am a current morbid teenager.
Hi, morbid teenager.
And
we love morbid teenagers.
I had very similar anxiety around death when I was younger, and learning about death positivity has felt so liberating that sometimes I just want to talk about death and be gleefully morbid all the time. So I was just wondering what you think about kind of walking the line between accepting death and maybe even being super interested in it, and being respectful or disrespectful, because I think when it collides with real life death experiences,
absolutely,
it can sometimes be like a conflict and
no, absolutely,
kind of a scary thing to have in real life. But then also when I'm just watching your YouTube channel, I'm like, yay, death!
LOL.
Yeah.
Did everyone hear that question? Okay. Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it's something we talk about. So the nonprofit that I have is the Order of the Good Death, and that's something we talk about all the time, because when we advocate for death positivity, that's a term that just caught on like wildfire, like crematory fire. And so we've kept using it because as an advocacy group, the point is to capture the public imagination, right? That's the idea. But death positive is also a tricky term because it doesn't mean oh, your dad died, woo! And it also doesn't completely take into account the fact that we live in gun violence culture, or rape culture, or trans violence culture, or African American cities being besieged by gun violence. All of the very harsh realities of living in America are not really totally represented in a term called death positive. But at the same time, what death positivity stands for is everybody's right to have the absolute best information you can have about death. So for those people who are victims of a quite sudden or tragic death, they need to have people like you around who know exactly how to get the lowest cost funeral, exactly what their rights are as a family, exactly what their power and the laws are for their family. And having people like that, because you're willing to engage with this and you're willing to learn all of this stuff, it's not the only purpose you have is going around and being to deflesh a skull, domestic beetles are used, everything about it is not whimsical. A lot of the work and a lot of the advocacy work is talking through incredibly difficult things with people. And if you can be that person in your community who, can have a lighthearted conversation with someone if nobody's actually dying, that's great. But also stepping in when there is a sudden death or a tragic death or just an unexpected death and saying, do you know, okay, you don't have much money. Do you know what a direct cremation is? Do you know these things to specifically ask the funeral director? Do you know the power that you have right now? That can be worth its weight in gold to any family. So I think reading the room and reading what a family needs, but you seem like someone who already, even asking that question means you're already sensitive to that. And so realize that there are two sides to what you are now an advocate for as well. That's a great question, though. Thank you. Where's the microphone now? Oh, right behind you. Oh, yeah. Okay. Hi.
Hi. I have this like super hopeful view of the future. If we actually get that Jetsons universe, we all get that space utopia we all wanted in the 50s and the 60s. I was wondering what would happen to a dead body in zero gravity.
In zero gravity? Well, actually, that's answered in Will My Cat Eat My Eyeballs? If only I had an answer for you. Page 7. I'll actually read you just like a little bit of it because I think the description is kind of cool, and I did so much research and I'm just really proud of it. So it's 2 words, many problems, space, corpse. So I'll just read this part. Dr. Lisa is our astronaut in this example. Unlike what you may have seen or read in science fiction, Lisa's eyes won't bulge out of her skull until she finally shatters in a blast of blood and icicles. Nothing so dramatic will occur. But Lisa will have to act quickly after her suit is breached, as she will lose consciousness in 9 to 11 seconds. This is a weirdly specific, kind of creepy time frame. Let's call it 10 seconds. She has 10 seconds to get herself back into a pressurized environment. But such a rapid decompression will likely send her into shock. Death will come to her before she even knows what's happening. Most of the conditions that will kill Lisa come from the lack of air pressure in space. The human body is used to operating under the weight of Earth's atmosphere, which cradles us at all times like a planet-sized anti-anxiety blanket. From the moment that pressure disappears, the gases in Lisa's body will begin to expand, and the liquids will turn into gas. Water in her muscles will convert into vapor, which will collect under Lisa's skin, distending areas of her body to twice their normal size. This will lead to a freaky Violet Beauregard situation, but will not actually be her main issue in terms of survival. The lack of pressure will also cause nitrogen in her blood to form gas bubbles, causing her enormous pain, similar to what divers in deep water experience when they get the bends. When Dr. Lisa passes out in 9 to 11 seconds, it will bring merciful reliefs. She will continue floating and bloating, unaware of what is happening. At this point, her heart rate and blood pressure will begin to plummet. We're at the point where her blood may begin to boil. The pressure inside and outside her lungs will be different, so her lungs will be torn open, ruptured, and bleeding. And without help, Dr. Lisa will asphyxiate, and we'll have a space corpse on our hands. So that is what will happen to a body in zero gravity. I sort of forgot how sad that explanation is. I was like, oh, I have an answer. Let me read it. Let me read you the science. Oh, yes, her blood will boil, her organs will rupture, she will bloat up many times her size, and she will die. Yeah. And then the question is, what do we do with her, right? And that's it's interesting, even writing a chapter like this, I can always really tell where my loyalties lie, because I'm like, oh, I have to do all this research to figure out how she'll die. Now I get to figure out what we'll do with her body. Like, that's always what I come back to. It's like, what can we do with the dead body? And there's a lot of different, NASA won't comment on this at all. And I actually have a contact at NASA who told me they won't comment on this. But, a couple, maybe how long ago? Maybe 10 years ago, they worked with Promessa, which is the Swedish company that freeze dries the body, to create something called the body back, as in like bringing the body back. So the idea is that they would put you out in deep space and freeze dry you and then bring you back in, and there would be this vibration chamber that just vibrates really fast and breaks you down, and there would be your body basically in powder form that they would put and store in the ship for however long to bring it back to the family. Or another option is just putting you in the trash chute, which is the coldest part of like the space station because you have to keep the food from rotting or the trash from rotting, but you don't want to put, an astronaut, a fallen hero, in the trash area. It's not like the best public relations vibe, right? And then also, could you just put her out into space like a sea burial? Like, that's what sailors do. Could you just push someone out into orbit and eventually she falls out of orbit and is cremated in some atmosphere, or just keeps rotating on the same orbit, and every time they pass, you're like, hey, Lisa, still out here. Okay, good to see you. So that's what fascinates me, is like, what do we do with the bodies? That was a longer answer than you probably wanted or needed. Thank you for your question. Where's our next person. Hi.
Hi, Caitlin. First off, thank you so much for coming out.
Oh,
we really
yeah.
appreciate- I'm a thank
Coming to New York is incredibly hard for me. Coming to the Strand is just like, oh.
Right. I can believe it.
It's not, if anyone.
No. I'm a child psychologist and I'm also a deaf and dying instructor. So to me, I use a lot of your stuff like in my practice. So thank you for that. My question is, in your travels, because I follow you on Instagram, you're great.
Thank you.
In your travels, what would you say, if you even have kind of a favorite of like epitaph or like grave style or like type of cemetery? Do you have a favorite or is it all good?
It is all good. Yeah.
Good.
Some of it's bad. No, it's all good. I have one of my favorite from a long time ago is I went to France, and I think I can't actually tell you what this is. Basically, the man's name was Leopold F. Word, and it just says that right on his grave. And so you can just take a picture like, me and old Leopold F. Word. That's a fun one. I was just in Russia, and the graves there are so good. They are so good. There was one that is actually the background of my phone right now that is big hands, like big, beautiful bronze hands coming out and like a giant ruby stone sitting in the hands. And it looks like an 80s fantasy movie, 100%. But the man was a heart surgeon. And so it's representing him like lifting up the heart, but it really looks like a like Gem in the Holograms, like sort of vibe. And there's another one in there, like, and everybody will have, especially if you were a certain type of man of a certain distinction in Soviet Russia, they would just carve you completely out of marble. So there was a man like holding a baby under his arm with a baby butt sticking out. And it was like, oh, he was an obstetrician, or like he delivered babies. And there was a man who was in the circus and he had a monkey coming out of his head. Just like, you don't see that in American Cemetery. Tell you what. So those are recently my favorite, is Russia. Yeah, who do we got? Hi.
Hi, Danielle. You're up there too. So
Hey.
So tomorrow, 12 hours from now, I have my first embalming lab.
Wow.
And I'm an EMT. I've been around live people my whole life. So what am I expecting? And do you have any tips? Do you remember your first day and what were you nervous about?
Are you in mortuary school?
Yes,
I
am.
Congratulations.
Yeah. Second year, getting there.
What do I remember about embalming lab? I personally remember not liking it that much, but I also remember that it was a means to an end. And I think that fully understanding every part of the funeral industry is really vital. You have some people who are very, very traditional funeral directors who say that natural burial is a myth. There's actually a woman in New York who says natural burial is a myth. Like flat earth or something. It's not a myth. There's a lot of natural burial grounds. And then there are people who are doulas or people really deep in the natural burial world who say that under no circumstances should anyone ever embalm. And I don't think that's true either. I think there are times where really extreme reconstructive work needs to be done, or the body needs to be sent all over the world. I think embalming really does have a helpful place for the family. I just think it's wildly overused. So especially if you've worked in trauma, you may see the absolute reason why somebody might need to be embalmed for the family to have any contact with them at all or see them. And I have a lot of respect for the people who do that intense work with the bodies. So just remember why you're doing it and remember what your goal is. Mortuary school is hard, but a funny story, funny aside, there is a man who worked briefly at my mortuary school, not while I was there. I've never met this man, who has started an online campaign to say that I failed out of mortuary school because I couldn't handle embalming lab. It's very bizarre. You're laughing like, what? I know that exactly. I have no idea. It's not hard. It's just you have to make sure you're dealing with your emotions and you're remembering why you're doing it. But good luck. I'm glad you're doing that. Thanks.
Hi. I can't believe you're making eye contact with me. Okay, so...
I've been making eye contact with you the whole night.
I'll see you after. No, I'm kidding. Okay. So That's my friend Kelly. Also, just really quick story.
Which one's Kelly? That's
Kelly, the one that just asked the question.
Oh, hi, Kelly. All right.
We work at the Disney store together, and the I can't even freaking make this up. The death doula that you made a YouTube video with came into the store, and I was like, Kelly, you need to come here right now. She thought like somebody was dying. Oh, that'd be great. Like, not great, but you know what I mean? Okay. So, now to my question. So I've been watching your videos for a while, and I've always had like, telling people, oh my God, cremation's like not green, whatever. And then my dog died a month ago, which was really terrible. And I didn't even have it in my head. Like, I was like, we need to get her cremated. And so I have the ashes and everything. And then I had this moment where I was like watching your video doing my makeup. I was like, oh my God, what have I done? Like, I was thinking like, it's not green. So I was kind of considering what helped me with my healing process. So my question is, when we're coming up with our plans for what we want to do when we die, do you think we should also consider what our families want for us because it's like part of their healing process, or should it kind of just be like what we want for ourselves?
Absolutely, it should be. First of all, there's no like greener than thou, green police sort of thing. Like, no one's going to come to your house and be like, oh, I guess you didn't really care about Mr. Fluffy, like, or you wouldn't have done that, or the environment bad. I don't think that that's the case at all. I think that something that I say I've been talking about a lot with this book is that so many people ask about keeping their dad's skull. That's like one of people's favorite question. Nobody's ever asked that to me in my funeral home. No, but it's the kind of thing that you fantasize about or you think would be amazing, but nobody comes into my funeral home expecting to get a cremation or green burial and it's like, by the way, could we just set up a skull decapitation and defleshing instead?
Bentham's head.
Yeah, exactly. No, that is not what happens. So it's really like in a moment where you're grieving or when a lot of people revert back to something that just feels comfortable, simple, they want to get it done. And I totally respect that. And I think there's not a problem in the world that you had, what's the animal's name?
Coco, and I got a tattoo of her because like that's how crazy I am. So yeah, she's really cute.
That's how loving you are. No one is going to disrespect your choices for Coco. I think that you absolutely made the right choice. And as far as does it make sense for you to consider your family, I think it does make sense to consider your family to a point. If you go to your family and you are actually able to have an open emotional conversation where you say, for example, I want green burial because it means so much to me to go back into the earth. I'm an environmental person in life. I want to extend that to death. I want to decompose into the land. I'm going to pay for the plot myself. This is important to me. If you say that and say your dad, for example, says, no, we're going to embalm you and stick you in the biggest, most expensive casket, the Promethean gold, and then put you in the family vault, and there's no way we're not going to do that, maybe never the twain shall meet between you two, and maybe you need to consider having an advance directive where a friend or a chosen family member is the one that helps you. But hopefully in those conversations, something is going to emerge that meets the two of you together, if that makes sense, and you might be able to find, and hopefully your dad is like, okay, yeah, I see why that would be meaningful to you, and then he can feel involved without feeling like you're like, this is what we're doing, don't care what you want, because your dad probably wants to do what you want, and most people want to do what you want, and if they really don't, and they're really not listening to you, at that point you have to consider doing what's best for you, but try it first, try having those open conversations first. But that's a great question.
Hi.
Hi.
Longtime viewer, big fan. Hello.
Thank you.
So in this era of sort of like strangely like existential like impending doom that's always kind of surrounding us with like the possibility of nuclear war,
I'm familiar.
Incoming climate change, climate catastrophe that's very much like possible. A couple years ago, I found like a lot of inspiration and hope in your videos, and I stepped back a lot from like my fear of death that I've had since I was a very little child. But it's kind of resurged just due to like these catastrophic possibilities that are very much like I don't want to say they're inevitable because you never know, but still, yeah. But how do you plan for death when like the threat is so existential, like when it's so big like that?
I think about that every day. Like death in the Anthropocene, basically. Yeah, that's so tough. I agree with you. I feel like there was really a point before a certain election, for instance, where the movement and the work we were doing was really sort of firing on all cylinders, in a sense. Like, people were really opening to the possibilities, green burials becoming more popular, conservation burials becoming more popular, we're legalizing alkaline hydrolysis left and right. You know, it's a really positive feeling. And everything could be sort of lighthearted. And then in the last 2-3 years, I think we've had a pretty rude wake-up call as to all of the work that needs to be done as an entire nation, and specifically in the realm of death awareness, death acceptance. The thing that I have to keep coming back to is that climate denial is 100% the denial of death. It is nothing else but that, is inextricably connected to that. That's what it is. And the reason that it's been allowed to run rampant and become this dangerous and become this threatening is that people cannot accept that we humans are in fact killing the earth, and that we are murderers, and that there is profound death involved in what we are doing. And it takes people like the people in this room who can stare that straight in the face, even though it's incredibly hard, and I'm not saying that's your responsibility at all. That's no one's responsibility to have to deal with. But if you have the clarity or mental health to handle that, you need to be telling people that and sharing that with people, and being someone who can look at that very harsh truth straight in the face and learn more about it and learn how to communicate it to people. And so that's not really fun advice, but I think that that is what is going to be necessary in the next 10 years, 20, the rest of our lives. It's going to be necessary for the rest of our lives. And I completely understand that it's not as hopeful, and that's really sad. It's sad for me, and I don't want to get to a place where I'm just a complete nihilist, and I'm like, let it burn! I tried to tell you, and you didn't care. I don't want to get to that place, because the world is so incredibly beautiful, and there are so many people that I love living on it. And I just try to think about them and what I know that other people don't know, and what we all know that other people don't know. So I don't know if that's helpful or not, but that's a really good question. And just to let you know, I also think about that and grapple with that all the time. So you're not alone. Thank you. Where is the microphone? Yes, hi.
Hi. First of all, I want to say I love you. I watch all your videos.
I love you. I've been looking you in the eye, but loving you.
And I was wondering, if someone wanted to go to a specific funeral home but was not in that state, could they still go to that specific funeral home?
Yes, yeah. And that depends on, so we think about this a lot right now because, for those of you who don't know, human composting was just legalized in the state of Washington. Yeah, round of applause for human composting. Only at this event. And should be every event. But we've had that conversation a lot because Katrina Spade, the person who legalized it and really the genius behind it, we talk a lot about, okay, are people going to come in from another state to have that, because it's only legal here? You know, are people going to drive up from California? And it's a really interesting kind of environmental question too, right? Because if you're in California, you're in Arizona, you're in Colorado, if we fly your body, which is totally legal, you just have something called the burial transit permit. If we fly your body up to Washington State, we drive your body up to Washington State, okay, you're using a lot of gas there. Like, does that really kind of, you know, ruin the benefits that you get from composting? But what you choose to do with your body is also sort of a political act in some cases too, right? So if you are going to compost your body and people know that you're doing that and you're making a statement and it's something that's deeply important to you, you know, I flew here from Los Angeles. You know, we fly all the time. Is that maybe worth it because you want to make that specific a statement by having your body there or having your body at a particular funeral home or whatever it is you're doing? So I think just weighing it out and really seeing where your desires lie and thinking about that is the right course of action. But the answer is yes, you absolutely go wherever you want. The world is your cemetery. No. Where is the... hi, I see it.
Hi.
I see hands and then I see a microphone. Like, it's me.
So when I think of mass graves, I think about medieval plague, mass burials, those kinds of things.
I'm going to write a memoir called When I Think of Mass Graves. That's really good. Okay.
I recently learned that there is an island in the Bronx that is still an active mass grave. So my question is, who's getting buried there and why?
Yeah, so you're talking about Hart Island?
Yes.
So there's an interesting distinction that we talk about between mass graves and communal graves. So mass graves has sort of fallen out of favor to describe, like mass graves are, Rwandan genocide or the Holocaust. It's these situations where the people were essentially killed. And then plague graves or indigent graves we call communal graves because mass graves has this really negative connotation where, but sometimes it should. Like even if it's communal. So I think about this a lot in Los Angeles. Our kind of version of this is a place in Boyle Heights where every year we cremate thousands of indigent dead or people who cannot afford a funeral elsewhere, and all of those ashes get dumped into one single grave. Thousands of them. And technically that's a communal grave, but is it also sort of a mass grave because we have such a problem with homelessness and we're not really helping those people? Shouldn't that be sort of shameful? Shouldn't there be a stigma around that? I would say yes. Hart Island, there are a couple people who I know who are the real experts on it, but my understanding is that it was a lot of prisoners' graves and graves that it's not so much, the real problem with it is that the families are not allowed to visit. So it's incredibly hard to get onto Hart Island. I think they go once a year, there's some loophole, or they stop doing that, so you can't even do that anymore. But basically the problem is that, okay, yeah, if you can't afford a burial right in the middle of, Greenwood or some beautiful place in the city, you have to go out to the island, but cutting them off from their family is also really not a good thing. So yeah, anybody who, I definitely, if you live in New York, look more into Hart Island and understand the implications of it. But, question? Hi, yes.
Hi. So I work in the tattoo industry, and I've recently seen a lot of people who will preserve tattooed skin of their loved ones. And I know that the Yakuza in Japan has been doing this for a long time because the tattooers they own the tattoo. Mm-hmm. What distinguishes, the ability to preserve skin over bones or flesh or anything else?
That's a fantastic question and something I'm really interested in. I don't think that the preserving of tattoos is honestly actually happening that much in the United States. And the reason being, so my friend Tanya Marsh, who appears 6 times in this book because she's the expert on human remains in America, is something called abuse of corpse laws. And every state has their version of the abuse of corpse laws and basically says that something like, you can't do anything with a corpse that would, quote, outrage ordinary sensibilities. Which, what does that mean? That's the vaguest law in the whole world. Because my sensibilities tell me, yeah, you should be able to preserve a tattoo if you want. Why not? Yeah, put your dad's head on the mantelpiece. I'm glad it's not a bone that you've paid $1,000 for from a mass grave in India. I would prefer it to be your dad. Keep it local, keep it consensual. So I think that it should be allowed, but at the same time, her contention, Tanya Marsh, the lawyer's contention, is that it just won't ever be quite legal to do the removal of a tattoo, especially if you're a funeral director. We were at the NFDA, the National Funeral Directors Convention together, and I was over talking to the tattoo people, and she's like, you can't do that, right? You know that you cannot do that at your funeral home. That will not work. I know you think it's funny or you think it's cool or interesting, but you will be in violation of abuse of corpse laws. And I will say this all day. And to be fair, most people don't know these laws the way she does. So my thought is that it's an exciting thing and an exciting concept, but it's not actually happening on the ground because basically the companies want funeral directors to do the removal. So if a family came to me and was like, can you slice dad's tattoo back piece off his back? I would be like, you can come have, same thing when someone comes in and is like, can I have grandma's gold teeth? I'm not going in her mouth with a wrench. And that's like the ghoulish idea of a funeral director, right? Is I'm like, haha, the gold teeth. I will, And so I say, if you want to bring in a dentist, happy to have you do it. With tattoos, I think I would say the same thing. I'm happy if you have a skin removal expert, a tattoo expert, I don't know who that would be, but someone else who is not me can come in and do that because I can't take on that liability as a funeral home, which is another reason I don't think it's happening as often as the internet maybe says it is. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there's a whole underground network of tattoo slicers. How much time do we have? Just one more question? I'm sorry. Oh my God, I didn't say that. I wasn't me. Maybe two more questions? Okay. Now fight for that microphone, everyone. Yes, hi.
Hi, another person who loves you over here.
Oh. Is it you?
It's me.
Oh, okay,
yeah.
cool.
Hey, hi.
Are you speaking on behalf of someone? Okay, cool.
Funny story. A few years ago, me and my friends may or may not have been a little drunk. I wrote out an advance directive that instructed them to dig a deep grave, maybe put some daisy sour cream in it, throw pierogies at my dead body as I'm falling into it.
Okay.
Is this something that can be used against me since it's no longer my wish? Because I signed it and there were witnesses. But can this even happen? And can it be legally used against me when I die?
This is a great question. I also have some follow-up questions. I love sour cream. First of all, why is it no longer your wish?
I just wanted to opt for something a little bit more green, sustainable.
Okay. I had to come to terms with the fact that pierogies simply aren't green.
I was like, it's going to smell really bad.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Well, no. So basically, who did you sign your advance directive to be your next of kin or to be your signer?
Ruby Joy Bear and my best friend.
Ruby Joy Bear. Okay. So Ruby Joy Bear has the power, basically, now. So if you cannot trust her to not do that, then you need to redo your advance directive. So where it gets complicated is when you sign a pre-need with a funeral home. So if you went into a funeral home and you paid them all the money for a certain type of burial, they probably wouldn't do a pre-need for you like this. Or maybe they would if they were a forward-thinking, like a foodie funeral home. Maybe they would. But it gets complicated when you, as the dead person, sign all the paperwork saying, this is what I'm doing, I've paid for it, this is purely with the funeral home. And then someone is like, oh, actually, I just want to cremate her and get all that money. That can happen sometimes. But that's where it gets more complicated. But the advance directive, really what you're doing is just deputizing your friend to be in charge. So as long as that person really knows what you want, I think you should be okay. And hopefully your wishes change in many and whimsical ways before your actual death.
Thank you.
We have one final question. Who's got the microphone? Okay, I think we have someone over here. Hi.
Hi. This feels like a lot of pressure now, knowing I'm the last one.
This is just the final question that everyone wanted. No big deal.
It's going to be perfect.
Yeah.
So my grandfather died like 20 years ago, got cremated, still sleeps like on a little nightstand next to my grandma.
Oh.
And when she dies, she's going to get buried and like hold him forever.
Oh.
But I realize that as she decays, he'll still be in a box and they won't actually be together. So I'm wondering if I should encourage her to like spread his ashes in her coffin. Also, what are the legalities around couples or family members choosing to be buried and therefore decomposing together?
Yeah, that's a great question. So normally what happens is somebody will go in the big vault and will be buried in the ground, and then a separate little vault will be put on top with the ashes. So when you see, two names on, a double-decker crypt, essentially that could be two full dead bodies. When you see a name that are like 12 names on one grave, it's because there are all these individual little holes that have the urns in them. I don't know how often it happens that you're allowed to put, I think it's really going to be cemetery policy more than funeral director policy. If it was up to me at the funeral director, I'm like, scatter them in the casket, like, put them in a teddy bear with her, like do whatever makes sense for you. But I think cemeteries tend to have stricter rules. So I would call the cemetery. If she's already planned on where she wants to go, call the cemetery and say, what exactly is it going to mean when we say burying her with her late husband? Because if burying her with her late husband means that he is in a vault like 3 feet away from her, completely cut off from the earth, completely cut off from her, you might not want to use that cemetery. That might not be right for you. Or you might want to get the funeral director to like slip little parts of him in the casket, secret like. Another option would be a urn that decomposes, like a salt urn, or like there's a ton of places, like we could sell you one. This is not an ad for our decomposing urn. I'm like, do you need a decomposing urn? Let me tell you where to find one. But many natural funeral homes sell urns that will decompose pretty quickly or are made of like paper or something. So he could still be in an urn as opposed to just scattered about her in the casket, but he would decompose sort of alongside her, and they would be joined in the afterlife, in the postmortem. So I think that would be the best idea, but I think that you're really going to have to check with the cemetery to make sure that that's going to work for them. And if they say no, just keep going until you find your right place. And I hope you do, because that's a lovely story. I think that's it, my friends. Thank you so much. Have an amazing evening. Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I am going to be, you have a system, right, Sabir?
We do. So I'm going to ask you, if you are taking part in the meet and greet and photo op, to please stay seated. We're going to call you up in rows, starting with the first row. Once we get through this section, we're going to move to that section.
Again, if you just want to go home and like eat popcorn, I will not be offended. That you're not here to hug me. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.
Cool. So if I could have the first